start now, although I believe some other people are on their way. We do have a sign language interpreter here for anybody who's deaf. Perhaps they would like to make themselves known. We may have Chris Harrell and his wife coming later, but we will continue. This is the first of a series of lectures relating to inclusive design. Now I have events lists for this week here, which lays out the dates and the titles of all the talks, and you're very welcome to those, which we put on the table. And also the subject, part of the subject of this evening's lecture is covered in a review done by the Architects' Journal, which is also available on that table, a few copies which our speaker has kindly brought. This is the first of the series. There are 5 talks, and the next one is not next Monday because it's a bank holiday, but the following Monday, and then consecutively until when are we? Can't see it now in front of me. The 22nd of June, when I'm told that all London taxi drivers will be here to talk about the accessible taxi. I would like to introduce Ian Taylor of Bennetts Associates to you. He's was originally going to talk about the Attenborough Centre, but he's expanded his talk to include other issues such as the Museum of the Moving Image, which I do remember when it was opened, and it was immediately went on the blacklist of inaccessibility, and that is to be changed. And he's entitled his talk, "Are You Feeling Comfortable?" Welcome, Ian. You did come a few years ago, and there was a rather heated debate about your project. But it's interesting that you've done a lot of building since then, and I have a feeling that the other people engaged in the debate haven't. So I think there's a little victory there. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good evening. When Andrew asked if I'd speak in this series of lectures, I wanted to talk about the Richard Attenborough Centre because that was the first building where the issue of access has been very seriously and quite thoroughly considered in the design carried out by the practice. But I felt I didn't want to just talk about that building. And when I was thinking of the title for the lecture, as Andrew said, that when I came here after winning the competition, the open competition for the building, I certainly didn't feel very comfortable. And I thought that might be quite a poignant title for the lecture. And I hope that this evening can be quite informal, and that I'd certainly like feedback and a discussion at the end. And I'll try and keep things reasonably short to enable that to happen. My main approach this evening is to discuss issues of comfort, because I feel that access is just a subset of issues to do with comfort and shouldn't really necessarily be the priority. The current regulations in the country pertaining to design for universal access, I don't believe ever mention comfort. And certainly the building regulations, which is the only statutory, well, one of the statutory documents apart from British standards, really just deals with access, how to get into buildings, and some technical requirements on the ergonomic design of sanitary conveniences and other details. I would argue that what is the point of spending a great amount on resources providing universal access if the spaces to which access is provided are not usable in themselves because they are uncomfortable to be in? And we should concentrate on creating the appropriate conditions which make spaces fully usable rather than on the means of entering them. the ease of navigation through and into buildings is one component of comfort. I'll just show two slides of the existing facility that the Richard Attenborough Centre had at the University of Leicester. This was as part of the Department of Adult Education, and they were trying to provide courses for local people and students of any ability, including some who had physical disability and learning difficulties. So I'll just show these two slides. Turn the lights down slightly. Their facility was actually an old kitchen in the student union of the university, and all the students loved it. The teachers found it very frustrating to work in it. There was very poor daylight, but actually there was a great sense of community there, and people went out of their way to get there. In fact, there were 3 steps up and 3 steps down into the building. Wheelchair users had to go in past the beer barrel store, and yet everyone was delighted to be there when they were there. And it was this atmosphere of the place which affected anyone who visited it, which we had to retain. There were difficulties in the building which they wanted to improve, but actually, in some way, this was a very usable space. It was a very comfortable space to be in. And that was mainly because psychologically there was support there. The tutors were very appreciative of all the efforts that the students made. But they were constricted and there were problems, so they had success in the face of adversity. But issues in their existing facility made us think about those things that contributed to making a successful building, which was accessible to everyone. I think one of the points there, which I'll come on to later, was that obviously everyone chose to be there. There was no coercion on the part of the students. They chose to go there, and they were helped with the access difficulties to actually take part in the events. Considering comfort, I think that can be split into 2 areas. There's physical comfort and psychological comfort. And I think there's probably more research and technical information available about the physical comfort issues, because generally these are covered by technical design standards, British standards, and particular technical data sheets available to environmental services engineers and others, which cover a whole range of issues: temperature, humidity, air quality, sound, light, and the specification of materials. Again, the building regulations don't cover these in great depth. And generally, we have to, as designers, pick in effect, the lowest common denominator. There's inevitably going to be different conditions are going to be perceived differently by different people, and I want to come on to that. But any temperature in a room, or in this room now, may be comfortable to some of us, but not all of us. We may start to become comfortable here while the women near the window find the noise outside and the wind coming in a distraction. So it's very difficult to arrive at a standard condition, but really we have to strive towards that. And part of that is actually understanding the particular needs that individuals have, which vary. How do people agree on what is comfortable? The psychological comfort in a space, whether you feel comfortable, also depends on other issues. They're affected by the function that you're engaged in. They're different if you're sitting down here at this lecture from myself standing up, talking. They're different in public spaces and private spaces, and the boundary between the two is significant. the number of people involved in the activity affect your perception of the space and what is comfortable. Age and sex affect that. We're all influenced by our society and our upbringing, so that our perception of what is comfortable is different as a British person who's been born here from someone in a different culture, in a different climate. And as I implied at the beginning, I think the atmosphere of the communication between the people is significant in making people feel comfortable in a space. There are some basic examples of this which I'll just show in an overhead, just to give the range of the issues that should be considered, really, and that you have to take account of. I'm sorry this is very small. So I've already failed at making people feel comfortable. It's just a little graph. It shows the difference in your people's adaptation to light and dark conditions with age. And it's just one of the examples that affect visual perception, is how old you are. We have a threshold intensity up on the side, which is the threshold that you have to reach before from which your eyes adapt, and the time that it takes to adapt to a varying degree of light. And the young people, 16 to 19-year-olds, can adapt very quickly to different light levels. And older people have a very different response. Similarly, your visual acuity changes. This is the ability to pick out detail. And again, here, a 20-year-old can react very quickly to changing detail and fine detail, but with age this drops off. So when considering signage and design of features in buildings, we have to consider age. That is an issue in this area. I think then we have to consider that wheelchair users, I think, are only about 4 to 6% of the disabled population. And there are a whole range of issues which we need to address. And it's interesting just to look at the range of agnosias, which are problems with perception due to brain damage, whether it's congenital or through accident. And just running through this list, there are certain things where you're unable to recognize things by touch because a certain area of the brain doesn't allow you to sense that anymore. And there's a fascinating left-right agnosia where, if a certain area of the brain is damaged, you can't recognize the left-hand side of objects. So if someone drew a person, they actually don't draw one half of the body, although that is how they perceive the person. I mean, it's a very complex area, but all these issues are things that we should be considering to a level. Obviously you can't consider all these details, but it just shows how complex the problem is really for us as designers. One fascinating thing, which I think had some relevance to the work that we did on the Richard Attenborough Centre, was looking at how many changes you can perceive and remember. For example, we had to consider tonal contrast. Partially sighted, designing for partial sight should first of all consider tonal contrast rather than colour. And how many changes in tone can you fit in before it gets confusing for people? And a lot of work has been done to show that if you're just changing one aspect of a condition, so if it's a sound, if you just change the tone, you can try and provide tones and ask people to separate them out to show how different or similar they are. And the limit comes to about 7 changes. After 7, it just reaches confusion. And one issue we asked some of the students, I rather naively asked, would it help if each room had a different door handle to touch, for example? And they all said, well, this was the blind users said, oh, it'd be terrible, it'd be so confusing. You've got to create a fine balance between difference and confusion. And I think the work we did at the Richard Attenborough Centre tried to address that. The brief that the University of Leicester set us was for a building that didn't have special features for disabled people. It didn't look as though it was a building for the disabled. And we took that on board, and in fact it tied in with my own thoughts on design and trying to provide design through passive means rather than lots of active technology. I could split the design principles that we followed into three. Firstly, we felt that there should be a great sense of place for everyone visiting the building, so that they had some feeling of, as they approached the building and used it, that they were in a special place, and it was particular because of the aspects of the site. Secondly, we should provide a very legible plan so that it was very clear for users, for any user, but particularly the partially sighted, to visualise the plan in their mind and therefore circulate around it very simply. And then this issue of variation and consistency, to try and make the right decisions on how often we varied aspects of the design and which things we kept consistent. And as we go through the photographs, I'll try and point out some of those points. First of all, the site wasn't very promising. It was the area of this house in the front of a rather large research building, and rather dominated by that and car parks on either side. The road itself, or the site, was sloping already at 1 in 20, so that's a ramp, almost as far as the building regulations are concerned, to start off with. One redeeming feature was the school grounds opposite, and the sky, which seemed to be the one relief on this site, was that you could look up and see light. The competition design split the building into 3 sections, a rear block, a central section and the front, and tried to introduce light in different ways in those 3 parts of the building, so that hopefully it would be clear which area you were in. As I said, the site was facing these playing fields, and the building faced here. The sun rose over on this side, and in fact this plan is upside down, so that the south sun was always coming in from the back of the building, which in itself was quite a tricky situation. So the building is split into the 3 sections. This front half had the entrance, the reception, with the sculpture room and library at the front. A tall space in the middle, which has top light coming in. And then a double height hall at the back, which was a multi-purpose room with drama and dance studios and music studios each side, and offices and an art room upstairs. The main slot where the main roof light was directly above the circulation, so on either floor you were underneath the same space, and you circulated parallel with the road on both floors and went into doors which were always in the same place on either floor. And that's the section through the back block. Those 3 parts of the building then we tried to have different characters, both spatially, the way they were lit, and particularly their acoustics. So this is the upstairs of the front block, looking out to the playing fields with a north light clerestory, which has proved to be quite effective for giving glare-free lighting for the sculpture room. The centre of the building has this glass roof light, which happens to be a completely structural glass assembly. The sandblasted fins hold up the whole roof light, and they're cantilevered out from the back wall. But this allows permanent display of the weather conditions outside in the heart of the building. And the fins themselves catch the light. I'll just go back one. So that even when the sun is behind the building, they're actually illuminating these and reflecting light back down. And the back part, the third element of the building, these photos have all been during construction, is just top lit and massive construction without any exposure to the outside world. Because light was very important, we did daylighting studies at the University of North London and the Bartlett, and this is the artificial sky at the University of North London with a 1:40 model, where we tried to modulate the natural light conditions inside so that you could use the building without artificial light for most daytime conditions. This is the building in use, just demonstrating really one of the issues on lighting, and that even though we had very good lighting, for some people you need extremely high lux levels for the visual acuity so they can work. So working right next to the window with a low sill, but also with task lighting as well, so that these people can actually see the work they're doing. I'll just run through a series of photos now, generally of the building. This is the facade facing the road. At night, tried to use colour to help indicate the entrance and to have the contents of the building visible from the street. And this black and white photo just illustrates some of the issues to do with tonal contrast, where we wanted to use quite a limited palette of colours, so that the floor is always generally a mid-tone grey, and the carpet and these concrete paving stones are quite similar tonally, but they feel different. And throughout the building, all the circulation has the same concrete paving stone detail, so whenever you're on that, you're on the main circulation. But we tried to consider this and then look at the colour afterwards. The plan of the building has the entrance here to reception. These are the areas of circulation with the paving stones. All the floor finishes in the back were timber, and the common room is carpet, but all similar tones. And then the fire doors, which are always held open on magnetic hold-open devices, are red. The seating was red, that was purpose designed. And all the doors were dark. If you get the design guides from the RNIB on what to do about visual contrast on doors and door frames, they say white walls, a different coloured architrave and skirting, and a different coloured door. Well, you can solve the same issue just by having white walls, white skirtings, and dark doors, and it looks rather better with light allemangry. The circulation slot in the centre has the stair at one end and the toilets at the other, and the toilets on both floors are in the same position. Once you're upstairs, you look down onto that circulation area, and there's a clear split between the front and the back of the building. That view is from here looking out. The hall can open up on different levels, so that the balconies either side can be closed off so that they could be used in association with the arch room, or opened up for viewing down into the hall. And the hall has doors at each end here, which open into the drama room on one side and the music room on the other. So try to make it as flexible as possible. And during the day, if there are concerts, the sounds do waft between areas, but without disruption to other activities. I'm sorry. Sorry, I'm just going forward. This is the sculpture room entrance, where you're going across the void back towards the front block and the views out to the park. And here the ceiling slopes to give good lighting in the space. We had to have very hard floor finishes just practically for the room, but the tiles around the basin area are textured so that you can feel people, the blind people do say it helps them orientate themselves in the room. Cupboards double up as work surface areas. The sinks in the art room and the sculpture room have identical arrangements, so whichever room you're in, people can learn to know where the controls are and the storage areas. And out at the front of the sculpture room there's a balcony, and this was seen to be very potentially useful for some of the people who have quite short attention spans. It's useful to have an area where they can go, get away from the main activity, just have a rest. At one time we wondered if the smokers should use this, but I think they may not be allowing them to smoke out there now. But interestingly, quite a large proportion of disabled people also smoke, so that's a consideration that should be borne in mind when designing for them. The building was on a slope, and so we used the higher side of the site to have a ramp access up to the upper level, which is hardly ever used as an entrance, but provides an at-level escape route from the upper floor, particularly for wheelchair users, so we didn't have to have any special wheelchair refuges in the building. There are certain features in the building which have been successful and some which we're still getting feedback on, and at the end, when we're in a discussion, I could happily go through some of those. But we wanted to have, or we thought it might be helpful to have opening windows that weren't glass but which were solid, so that when they were open they looked different from when they were closed, and it might help a partially sighted person to notice more readily whether the window is open or closed, or open or shut. I haven't really yet had feedback enough to know whether the idea worked or not. And these are just a number of construction shots which are just in here because they're all the other issues which aren't actually to do with access, but which I think do contribute to the feeling in the building, which most users say is quite calm and very functional. As I said, I think in the discussion we could run through a number of the items, responses we've had from users over the last year of the building, because some things have proved to be quite interestingly unsuccessful. It's not a complete success story, but any project where we're investigating things will have some good points as well as some things that should be changed if considered again. I'd just like to finish by talking a little about the museum moving image. As Andrew says, this is a building which is actually only 10 years old, and the practice was invited to put a proposal for a feasibility study to the British Film Institute, and we were commissioned to carry out a National Heritage Lottery Fund bid for the museum. That bid is currently with the Department of National Heritage, or the fund assessors at the moment, and hopefully we'll get some response during this summer as to whether the project might get funding. As Andrew says, the museum itself has had problems with access, and in fact Andrew was involved at one stage pre-feasibility in doing an appraisal of those. But we felt that the issues of designing for universal access were fundamental for the success of a new museum. And the design team had a very good advice and consideration of those issues, Bennetts Associates and Land Design Studio museum designers worked together with the client on the planning for the new museum, and James Holmes Seidel of All Clear Designs was the access consultant. And I'm sure James wouldn't mind me just reading a little out from his report on the project. To start off with, just something from his report to the BFI before the designing started, pointing out the range of issues that the museum should address. He wrote, intellectual access is aimed at 5 user types: casual browsers, children, low literacy adults, people with learning difficulties, and people who do not have English as a first language. These users will in fact make up a large number of visitors to the museum. I think it's significant that those issues are all very relevant in a museum, and we had to address those in the design of the concept for the building and address them in the way that the museum content would be displayed. In the report that's gone into the Heritage Board, there are a number of items which I'll just read from, which give you some flavour of the approach the team's taken. In the disabled population, wheelchair users make up between 4 to 6% of the population. The remaining 96% largely have sensory disabilities and learning difficulties, which can be addressed in the physical design of the building. Wheelchair users make up an important group of disabled people, but there are many buildings and parts of buildings where wheelchair access cannot be achieved. Wherever it can be achieved, it will be. As a footnote to that, in fact, a fundamental principle of the design is that all the areas, both for the public and all the staff, should be accessible by wheelchair, certainly as far as possible. The definition of access assumes that a disabled person will want to be independent. Only in situations where there may be a risk to a disabled person or other users of the building will the design be adapted to allow access to be controlled by the building management. Now that might be in a fire escape situation, where a public building of that type would have a very controlled evacuation procedure where staff would be allocated to help certain people out of the building. But again, fire escape is a big issue which I think affects people's perception of comfort, because anyone in a building they don't know wants to naturally know how to get out if anything happened, and particularly so for partially sighted or physically disabled users. Significantly, the museum has interpreted access to include a wide range of people, the most significant of which is intellectual and sensory access to the collection, while ensuring that access for people with mobility disabilities is also considerably improved. The museum layout has been driven by usability and accessibility features. Circulation in the museum was seen as extremely important to the successful use of the space by a wide range of people. The scheme to completely ramp the space, that's the circulation, makes its use by people who have mobility disabilities and parents with pushchairs extremely simple. Everywhere can be reached using a ramp. Not only does this make it entering extremely easy, but it also makes the escape approach to the building simple and effective. The ramps at 1 and 15 are to a gradient which will not significantly hinder people with mobility disabilities who do not prefer ramps, and there are frequent resting positions to allow people to recover from the distances involved. While the total ramp distances are long, these are broken frequently by the journey, so they will not become tedious for wheelchair users. The open and visible nature of the ramps means that the route through the museum is extremely legible for users. This is important for all users, but especially for people with learning disabilities, which make up a large group of the disabled users. It is difficult to overemphasize the advantages of this approach to the layout of the collection, which has also been adopted in the exhibition displays. The volumes, route through the building, and internal layout of the exhibition should all lead to one of the most accessible and effectively interpreted museums of its kind. I'll just show you brief images of that scheme. The museum is at the moment shoehorned under Waterloo Bridge, and many people who even have recognised that the museum is there don't know where the front door is because it's very difficult to find. Our brief was to prepare a design that would tie in with changes to the South Bank Centre, and so the design will work with or without the Rogers changes on the South Bank. The principal organisation being that the National Film Theatre is planned to move to the West End, which releases all the space from this line here towards the river for expansion of the museum, of the moving image. We looked at whether that expansion should only take place in the area of the National Film Theatre, but in that analysis realised that the future of the museum will best be served if the existing museum, which is only 10 years old, were changed completely. The diagram of the circulation is to have the facade facing the Royal National Theatre as the main elevation, so that everyone will know that the front door is on that elevation. And you go in here. You can also get in from the terrace of the South Bank Centre by the Hayward at the upper level here and drop within the space. All the circulation for the galleries is then arranged in this new elevation along the side of Waterloo Bridge, so that people from the outside will be able to see that circulation, which in itself will be part of the display. So that having gone in and bought a ticket, you would circulate up here, going into exhibits and out, and into exhibits and out, and up and into exhibits and out, crossing over the centre and going back down in a similar way on this side. This will allow people to go to the museum and do a quick tour for, say, half an hour, work out which bits they want to go and see, and then go back to particular areas. It should be very clear how to get from the start to the finish, something which no one can do if they're halfway through the museum at the moment for the first time, and allow resting places for visitors, allow repeat visits just to particular issues that you want to look into in more detail. And then that feature itself at night will be animated by circulation within it and the use of that area for displays. This is the planned diagram showing the red area as the public circulation, and you'd be able to walk through here without paying any money from side to side. Completely open public part of the museum. And then you could circulate into the history of cinema on this side, or new technologies and computing on this side. At the start of each area, there's a cinema here at the beginning of cinema, and a television studio there at the beginning of television and new innovations. So quite a clear diagram that will allow good flexibility in the future. The elevation could be used for projection or other displays, but actually be used so that people realise what the content is. I think that was probably the idea of the Avery scheme, but unfortunately the way it's planned internally just doesn't allow that to happen. It's a completely dead space at the moment. One of the big problems with the museum is this change of levels, and so we have decided to use ramps, which we did debate at some length as to whether that was actually helpful to everyone, but overall we felt as long as we provided rest areas and you could go down, you could go up to the top and back down on occasion if someone would find it very difficult to go uphill, that it would allow most people to get to most places, well, most people to get to every place. And there would be lifts as well for those who would find ramps difficult. We designed this so that from the bridge up here, there'd be extra seating areas where you could look down into the museum and down to the street, which at the moment you can't do because the roof of the theatre completely blocks off any contact between the two spaces. And then this ramp goes up and can be used for introductions to the displays. The section is very complex and has lots of changes of level which the ramping system resolves. But here you see this is the new elevation which we propose sticks up above the parapet of the bridge so that it could be used for display on the bridge side. These are one example of one of these new seating areas off the side of the bridge, like an old packhorse bridge area. where you can sit and look down at the exhibits into the National Theatre. And then the ramp takes up the changes of level and provides access to the bottom level, which has got educational facilities, changing ramped exhibit areas, and back up to the upper levels. So that hopefully this is a detail of the model which Land Design Studio made, hopefully by having a very straightforward plan and the use of ramps, we'll be able to create variation in section in a similar way to the quite straightforward plan of the Richard Attenborough Building Centre, where the plan was very straightforward, but the variety, both providing variety of light, acoustic, and for other senses, is provided by manipulation of the height and the surface finishes. So that's a little preview of that scheme. As I say, that no one knows at the moment whether that will get the go-ahead. We're very hopeful, and I think it will develop over time. That's it. I think what I'd like is to have a discussion, if we can, about some of the issues, and I'd happily go through some of the reactions to the Richard Attenborough Centre as well. Andrew.
Thank you very much. I'll let you have the microphone in a minute. Thank you very much, Nidian. It'll be very refreshing. When I first went to the Museum of the Moving Image, I was immediately attacked and taken to the nearest lavatory, because they said that there won't be another one for 2 hours. So those days are over. I have a question myself, if I can start off by... the bridge is a listed bridge. And you're suggesting adding to the sides of it. Is that on the listed bit?
No, the listing by English Heritage goes to the back of the staircase that runs up from the promenade up to the bridge at the front. So we're only proposing going up higher than that in the viaduct approach to the bridge, not the bridge itself. And we've discussed that with English Heritage.
Any questions from the floor?
It'd be nice if you use your microphone a bit more. It's very audible.
Well, I'm sorry, that was, it's here and it's out of my control.
Right. Can you tell me how you go about getting feedback
On a project?
from that described
Right.
getting feedback
Okay.
from users?
Right. Well, obviously it's quite straightforward to get feedback from the client. Sorry. Could you turn the mic up a bit, please? Should I use this handheld one? Okay. Oh, sorry. Obviously it's reasonably easy to get feedback from the client because they're the people we meet on a regular basis. Can you hear? I'll just press it. Sorry, I can't do much about that. All right, I'm sorry. Was it rather monotonous?
Would you like to come to the front?
Okay. Yeah, can I lean on here? What we did to get feedback from the students was informally when I went up to the building to talk to some of the students who I met right from the outset. But then last November we had a session where we particularly had asked a group of the students to come for a discussion about the building. And I asked a whole series of questions which were faxed up to the centre. And a number of the students who had been involved advising the client from the outset attended, and those who didn't sent answers back on some of those issues. And it was quite heartening to find that some of the ideas were working, and surprising on the reaction of some of the other issues. I mean, should I just go through a number of those? One comment that had come from the staff was that one particular student found the building very intimidating and didn't find it comfortable at all. And it was someone who I think was schizophrenic, and he found it much too open and light and bright for him. And so when he came to work there, I think he ended up sometimes coming in the evening when it was darker and felt more enclosed, and also when there weren't other people in the building. One of the interesting points made by a number of the blind users was that some of the variation in the acoustics in the rooms worked very well. But the big void in the middle, they felt, because it was so large, when they came out of the toilets, it was disorientating because they didn't get a good reflection back, and it felt they couldn't orientate themselves because the space was too big. I think some of the other comments to do with light were interesting. I'll just read some of those. The sculpture studio, the quality of light is considered to be good with no glare, and the side light from the front windows was good. And interestingly, the totally blind commented that some of them, although they couldn't see the light, appreciated the changing qualities inside the building. We half expected problems on the staircase because the half landing goes up to a full size window, and there could have been problems with glare there, but no one found that to be an issue. I think partly because it was orientated towards the northwest and hardly ever got direct sun into it. Some of the external handrails were not tonally contrasting enough. Direct sunlight was experienced by some of the blind users as warmth on the body, so even though they couldn't see it, they liked the fact that in some areas in the building it actually shone onto them. In the toilet, some of the blind users were concerned at the quiet toilet flush because it was so quiet that they didn't always know that it had flushed properly, which is an interesting issue. We discussed the smell. It's one thing I didn't mention, that the timber work around the hall was made in cedar of Lebanon, and areas of that were left untreated so that the aroma would remain. And apparently that has been noticed by many of the blind users, even when they enter the building, let alone around the hall itself. So I think that was well worth looking at. Although when we went on to discuss the use of smell to aid orientation for partially sighted users, some felt it had to be used very carefully because it can disorientate if it doesn't work. And they would generally prefer to rely on touch than smell, particularly externally where air movement can be more disruptive to the smells. I think the acoustics in the sculpture room haven't worked all that well, but that was something that we partly anticipated because the budget didn't allow us to put acoustic absorption in on one of the surfaces, particularly the ceiling. So hopefully shortly we're going to be adding some drapes or high-level absorption. But going back to your original question, we had a formal session where we asked the students their responses, and then I issued them back a file note which suggested things that the client perhaps should consider to improve the situation in the building. And I think all the time the staff there are trying to make note of issues so that even if nothing can be done there, at least we can get some feedback to help on future projects. Yeah.
It was a very important charity argument that you sort of more.
Yeah.
Yes. That's good. And secondly, the first question was, did that carry through from the together?
No, the client themselves aren't at all patronising.
And secondly, what's the conversation with the design?
Consultation then? All right, well, during the competition I went, I specifically asked if I could go up and visit the existing facility, which is when those photographs were taken. And we spoke to the staff and a number of students who happened to be there on that occasion. And then, following appointment, we had a whole series of visits up to discuss the issues with the students. And also the students have been helping the staff of the centre to assemble the brief in the first place. The client separately consulted with a whole range of bodies of organisations involved in the field, which I wasn't always involved with. They did a lot of that themselves and then reported back with comments from those bodies. I think they were. For example, in that old kitchen where they were working, quite a lot of the students who were partially sighted said that they found it very helpful that the old fat air extract hoods altered the acoustic in the space, so that helped them know where they were relative to the desks. I mean, just little observations like that would start to alter the way the design was approached. Because, to be quite honest, they weren't always things that I'd considered before. I hadn't been in a position where they were at the forefront of the brief, in effect.
That's some of what we suggested at the back there. When you were describing the building, I was wondering whether if there hadn't been a strong disability brief, you would design that building in the same way, if there hadn't been that, you would design a different building.
Yes, it would have been a different building if the client hadn't helped to make those issues important.
And now retrospectively, you still, now having worked through the example, apart from the things which you know don't work anyway, if there was still not disability input, would you still design the way you work?
Well, interestingly, hopefully now, well, personally, those issues are always at the forefront of the approach. And, I mean, strangely, some of the best solutions to the problems are actually just beneficial design ideas. Like having a wide corridor with an area where you can stand out of the way and talk to someone without getting in the way of people, just as a nice thing. And so,
these lectures is inclusive design, so it's what I'm trying to understand whether, having now you've gone through that specific exercise, and obviously it's very difficult to know what you're going to do.
yes. No, I think that more often than not, when we are looking at an issue, the solution which seemed appropriate also could have some benefit on other issues. So, as I just mentioned about the doors, for example, what colour to do the doors and the skirtings, as long as you do consider it as an issue and don't just paint everything white, but decide, well, it shouldn't all be white, we should make it easy for someone to recognise where the door handle is and which way it swings. It's then just a design exercise. Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Was there anything to do with this then? No.
I can't think of anything that was an active disbenefit. And actually, I don't think that addressing the issues adds cost either. I mean, that's a separate issue, but it's sort of connected really, in that as long as the issues are thought about, they needn't be solved by expensive means or difficult means.
Can you answer why different types of
Hopefully our buildings will be. I can't speak for other designers. I think sometimes it's because people who are designing buildings don't think about people using them. Quite simply. People. Whatever, whoever. About the people. Because that's what we're designing buildings for, unless it's a big store for books or something. And then you still have to get the books. I mean, that's why I personally wanted to enter the competition. Those issues are to do with function and how you make an enjoyable environment for people to use. And I think that's why, in the end, I think access is in some ways should be a secondary issue. Because if generally, the problem is with any regulation is that designers will use it as a maximum standard, not a minimum standard. And people will say this as long as they've got their ramps and disabled toilets. Good architecture.
what people usually say when they come around is they need to hire
There's a follow-on course in the second building that you're in the museum. I thought you might go when you were in Paris. I took the course yesterday when I was going to the one of the things that struck me about that whole area is
Intelligent, able-bodied people can't find the front door of the facility you're going to. Yeah. So you can solve all the universal access issues just by sensibly addressing issues of circulation and hierarchy in the spaces, and that's the problem. It doesn't need a big glass roof, in my opinion. It just needs a sensible appraisal of urban space and circulation. Start off with.
As far as you're concerned, the current schemes you're building, you will carry on to produce a scheme if constructed for that site. I mean, you wouldn't turn around the current say this is the site.
Well, obviously we have a brief which is on that site, but I don't know. I don't think it is inherently the wrong site for an international museum. I think access can, I think the issues can be solved to create a building which anyone can get to and enjoy. It's a separate debate as to whether that area of the South Bank should have all these facilities.
It's not the sort of place you will ride at casually. I mean, you walk literally as I did miles along that thoroughfare. If you don't know where you're going, why you're going there, you will arrive there by some means or other. But if you they've created an enormous walkway, which obviously is going to be one of the central themes. And it's not a very, it can be a very unpleasant, it was a sunny day when I was there, but it could be a very unpleasant experience. I mean, there's enormous distance. Travel is enormous distance. There seems to be an awful lot of those activities down there, the most unsympathetic location.
Mike, there's going to be a presentation in a few weeks' time on the whole of the South Bank Centre. Can we leave that bit for now? Given other people want to ask questions.
So if I can respond to that first, it triggers the novel idea that maybe we could put in a lottery bid for the moving museum of the image, which would never quite be where you expected it. And it would always be somewhere else. The question was, were you forced to justify your innovative architecture on the basis of energy costs, expected benefits of having good light penetration? Were there arguments that too much glazing would lead to heat loss in the winter? Or was the client so inspirational and above all that somehow they gave you a free ride on those issues? Do we have to
They're not.
prove both benefits?
You do have to prove both benefits, and the building is not wasteful in energy. I mean, one thing I should have said really was that I think the issues of sustainability in design are actually making people think more about what makes a place comfortable and pleasant to be in. And one of those is definitely natural lighting. And so from the outset we set out to achieve good lighting levels, but without excessive solar heat gain, which would cause problems with overheating in the summer, or excessive areas of glazing that would provide heat loss problems. So it is a big issue. I mean, for example, on the Museum of the Moving Image, as it happens, the facade where we're wanting to do a glass facade isn't facing south, or else you may, from the outset, say you don't do that solution. So I think that the agenda for minimising the environmental impact of the building can go quite happily hand in hand with solving access problems.
That's very good news, because there seems to be rather more political emphasis on creating architecture for good energy use at the moment than there is about creating an amenable environment, use that instead of excessive. You know, an environment that actually meets human needs rather than one that meets clients' priorities. We live in an age where so many buildings are not designed by the end user, but people have divorced the human function of the building from the design of it.
Well,
we're trying to blend this back together. I think you're quite right. People, especially if we move to an era when climate change is greater in Britain, and we normally expect a greater range of temperatures, partly for man-made reasons, partly for climate reasons. I think we do have to think it strikes me as ironic in Britain that if you're a tomato, environmentally you're probably treated better than if you're a person, because we do have sophisticated technology for regulating the growth of garden produce in the greenhouses. They are climate controlled to a far greater degree than a lot of the buildings we spend our lives in.
I think those issues of well-being are, as I say, are part of the environmental agenda, and I think there's a push towards incorporating those more into assessment programs. So, for example, I don't know if you're aware of the work, the BREEAM assessments that the Building Research Establishment organise. So, say if we're designing an office building at the moment, we can apply to get a BREEAM rating, and the aim is to get an excellent rating, which is an indicator of how environmentally conscious the design is, and its energy use is low and things. Well, that's currently being updated so that in September it'll start to include more on the health of the occupants, issues of air quality, and those side issues.
And will it
And
be that
I think so, yes. I think so. And also the sustainability sort of agenda places sort of one quarter emphasis on social well-being, because you can't have a sustainable world unless you have people who are content and encourage.
Reduce lifestyle materialism. Yes.
Yeah.
It will be difficult. It's
Mm.
I'd like to bring the discussion just back to the use of these two buildings. And what interests me very much is that both these buildings are involved with the visual arts primarily, the arts, but primarily with the visual arts. Just to put these two projects in a slightly broader context, the relationships that strike me are to do with existing art college buildings, for example, and existing museums. I wondered if there were particular precedents in the design of art schools or museums that you felt were existing extremely good examples of the kind of use function that those buildings are designed to offer, that could also work as well across this boundary between access, utility and comfort, which is the point that this began on this evening, which I like quite a lot, this distinction between utility and comfort, with a particular emphasis on the arts function of the building.
Well, I have to admit of not studying the precedents very greatly, but we did visit a number of buildings with the client before the bachelor scheme started. And we went to the Royal College of Art and an educational suite in the National Portrait Gallery. I think I'm not answering your question very well because I don't know the range of types, but I think there are pockets of good practice in the country, and I think some of the I don't know. One building I visited recently with a separate client was the Burrell Collection in Glasgow, which is a big gallery on 2 levels. And I would imagine for lots of the criteria that would work quite well, although there are some problems with overheating in it. But I think some buildings where there's a sequence of spaces and wide circulation on one level work very well. It's when the plan is quite difficult to read that certainly some of the issues to do with legibility become problematic. I mean, the Uffizi is quite a good precedent for the MOMI diagram, in that there's a circulation route with rooms off it, and you can go into whichever room you want. I'm sorry, I don't.
Well, the Leicester building interests me because it's building to, I mean, I haven't read the brief, so I don't know that intimately at all. This is my first sort of scientific proceeding, but I find it a really interesting problem because it combines spaces for making work and spaces for exhibiting work in the same building. And I've certainly had a little bit of experience in working in buildings that combine that sort of function where, in fact, the fact of new building is very inhibiting. Very, very often the studios of institutions that are involved with the making of art or the teaching of the making of art are very messy, rather very uninhibited spaces, precisely because they're lived in. And I think it will be very interesting to see how your building develops.
All right. Well, we
as it gets messy.
Yeah. Certainly the discussion with the users was that the sculpture room and the art room should be allowed to get messy. So the floor in the art room, which is a timber floor, doesn't matter if it gets wall paint over it, because that's what happens in an art room. And in the sculpture room, all the door panels are used as pin-up space for big paintings. So you just get masking tape, pin up and paint, and it goes on the furniture. It doesn't matter. Certainly, those aspects of their original studio, which was chaos, sort of some order in chaos, was very attractive. On the other hand, there's the university client who say, oh, this floor's getting dirty. You didn't think about that, architect. You know, and I say, well, we did, and it doesn't matter. And they say, oh, well, you know, how are we going to maintain it? I hope that there will be spaces in the building which will just be transformed by being lived in. So the tops of the cupboards are all shelves for sculptures to be put on, things like that. So only perhaps nothing's precious actually in the end. Hopefully it's a background to allow it to be used in whatever way, and in fact they have had a number of exhibitions in places using walls that we haven't particularly thought about using. And they're having lunchtime concerts in the circulation area rather than the hall, which we hadn't ever contemplated, because they say the acoustics great. So that's fine if the building takes on a life of its own. I think the Museum of Moving Image will be different, because that's probably got to be quite a controlled exhibit. It's not a working, well, except they do have artists in residence, they have a kind of animation and things. So again, hopefully there'll be areas there which can respond to their use. They welcome anyone who would like to go. Yeah. I could send you a program of their activities if you want, because they have concerts every week, and they'd be very happy to have a discussion. I mean, if your group would like to go up and meet some of the students and discuss the issues, I'm sure that could be arranged if anyone's interested.
That would be in the events list, so we'd include people who read the events list.
Okay. Well, I apologise for not being more demonstrative in my speaking. I'm not very good at public speaking, and I'll try. Next time I'll try better. I wasn't perhaps as prepared as I should have been. I have.
Thank you very much, Ian.